Okay, hi everyone. Thank you all for tuning in today to Gen Up Fremont and American ASB's Student Support Circle. Over the past few months, we've been collecting students' testimonies about their experiences with mental health, harassment, and discrimination at American in an effort to start conversations about how to create a more safe, welcoming, and inclusive environment at our school. These conversations start today, and as we continue to discuss potential solutions, we encourage students to keep submitting their stories at tinyurl.com/AHS testimonies. For the content that we discuss today, Rachna, our ASB secretary, will be taking notes throughout the duration of the panel, so we'll have a reference in the future. Without further ado, we will now introduce our panelists and go over the rules and format of the panel. So on our agenda, we have panel introductions, which will follow into the format, rules, and then the public comment topics. So first, let's do the introductions. My name is Bella. I'm a senior at American, and I'm also the ASB president for this year.
My name is Benjamin Tarver. I am a senior at American, and I'm the senior class senator for class of 2021 and a representative for Fremont Gen Up.
Hi, my name is Anusha Nayak. I am a junior at American High School, and I am the current ASB vice president.
Hello, my name is Jeffrey Wei. I'm a senior at American, and I am the current ASB Chief Justice.
Hi, I'm Rachna Idol, and I'm currently the ASB secretary.
Hi, I'm Ria Gantla. I'm a senior at American, and I'm the current ASB treasurer.
Hi, I'm Kemi Yua. I graduated American in 2015, and hi.
Hi, I'm Isaiah Zachariah. I graduated from American in 2018, and I'm also a community organizer.
Hi, I'm Chris Fulton. I'm a history teacher and the activities director at American.
Hi, I'm Megan Barrington. I'm the principal at American.
Hi everyone, Sumaya Kardagli. I am an assistant principal at American High School.
Hi, I'm Priya Raman. I'm a parent of a student at American, and I also am the president of the PTSA this year.
Hi, I'm Sarah Barwani. You may also know me as Sarah Nihigian, and I am a counselor at American.
I'm Kimura Drakes. I'm the counseling and rich special education instructor at American High School.
Hi, I am Meifeng Howell. I'm a math teacher, also interventions teacher as well at American High.
Ms. Sangam just dropped in, but would you mind introducing yourself?
Hi, I'm Ms. Sangam, Usha Sangam, and I teach math this year, geometry and algebra at American High.
Hello, I'm Dr. Hernandez, and I teach history at American High School.
I am Sarah Noss. I teach social studies at American High School.
Mr. Krieger, I think you were on mute.
Everything was going so well. John Krieger, American High School, sophomore English.
See, I'm Diane Jones, school board trustee.
And my name is Zach Larson. I'm the director of secondary education for Fremont Unified.
Thank you, panelists, for all those introductions. Anusha, if you could please continue the screen share so we can go over the rules and format of the panel. Thank you very much. So for the panel format, Bella Jong and I, our moderators, will read the public comments about mental health and microaggressions collected from our student body and alumni. And after hearing these submissions and taking a 5-minute break, we will then discuss the various topics brought up by answering certain guiding questions pertaining to each topic specifically. So some general rules from our panelists. Please remain respectful and open-minded. Please remain on mute and have your cameras on throughout the duration of the public comments being read out. Everyone is encouraged to be active participants in our discussion. And if you could, please use the Zoom function in the participants tab to raise your hand if you want to say something in the discussion, and our moderators will call on you to speak.
So for today's panel, our public comment topics consist of ableism, sexual harassment and assault, staff interactions and student treatment, mental health, sex, gender, and LGBTQ+ discrimination, microaggressions, and racial discrimination.
So now we will be going over the stories. As a warning for our listeners, the details of the stories you are about to hear may be disturbing. So if you are sensitive to hearing information about sexual assault, harassment, or mental health problems, feel free to leave the call now and return to the live stream when we finish with these stories by somewhat around 3:40 p.m. And with that all being said, we will now start reading student testimonies.
There's an extremely toxic culture of ableism at American that is perpetuated by both teachers and students. Students constantly laugh about memes relating to special needs children and pass it off as, quote, dark humor, end quote, or dank memes. They refer to them with slurs like, quote, SPED, end quote, or the R word. They make a joke out of being nice to special needs children and take advantage of their kindness. Right after special needs children leave a vicinity, students at American go right back to making fun of them and how they interacted with them. Also, in the past year, one special needs student in particular began dancing in the rotunda at lunch. Though it was an uplifting thing to see, the audience reaction was not. Students were openly recording him and making fun of him, but he misunderstood it as praise. On top of that, some teachers were laughing while others were standing right beside the bullying students and not doing anything. This event happened multiple times over the course in a few weeks, and still nothing was being done. In fact, students and teachers were openly excusing ableist behavior, which is part of the problem. Also, in one of my classes, there was a student who has a physical disability that prevents her from clear speech. Even though the disability was only physical, my teacher continued to patronize her and speak condescendingly towards her. Maybe she had good intentions, but it was unacceptable for an adult of her education. She wouldn't even make an effort to understand the student, even though everyone else in my class did, and would give her vague responses without actually listening to the student. It was disgusting behavior to witness from a teacher, and this, along with the ignorance in the AHS community, is truly disappointing.
A teacher had called a student in class the R slur, and I don't think that should be accepted.
I am a person who identifies as non-binary, and I remember my freshman year, I got forcefully outed to a bunch of my peers by someone else. Not only was that moment humiliating enough as it is, I had to explain what non-binary is and the pronouns that I preferred to use. I ended up receiving hate and slurs, and no one respected the pronouns I had previously explained I used.
Gender discrimination is not new to AHS by any means. I was part of a club and I had to check in with an unnamed teacher about a guest speaker. Because the guest speaker was thinking of becoming a long-term mentor for an unnamed club, I had to ask this teacher about whether it would be okay for me to do this. There was some general discussion regarding this topic. I don't remember exactly what, but ultimately, this teacher ended with saying, "Yeah, you can do whatever you want, but it's not on me if he's a pedophile." Obviously, his statement left me very uncomfortable. Why did he have to suggest that this mentor would be a pedophile? It scared me and I was very taken aback. Later on in the year, this teacher refused to change a grade I had shown him was incorrect on School Loop. He had inputted a test grade that I had the paper for and said he would not change it even though I showed him proof that he had incorrectly inputted my grade. This teacher could not accept my success in his class, and even if I had reported, I would have just faced more discrimination from this teacher as he would find new excuses to lower my grade. In addition, the PE teachers at AHS have to understand the limitations of a girl when she is on her period. I have a number of friends that were forced to participate during the swim unit, despite being on their period, because the teacher refused to excuse them for the days they missed because they were on their period during the swim unit. It is absolutely atrocious that teachers can be so inconsiderate to 50% of the school's needs and essentially force these girls to participate in the swim unit, even though they were not comfortable wearing a tampon. Many of my friends would swim with a pad, which is not meant for the water. And the teachers could justify their act by saying, quote, "We didn't force them to swim during their period," unquote, even though they refused to give them credit or excuse them. The worst part of all of this is the fact that even if I had reported any of this, I knew nothing would happen. I had a friend who was sexually harassed, and I encouraged her to report this to her counselor, which she did. Ultimately, the school conducted an investigation and concluded the boy had been sexually harassing her, but proceeded to do nothing about it and let it all go. The boy was let off with no consequences. This type of behavior on the part of the school is absolutely atrocious. Students should at least have the comfort of knowing that injustices they face at school can be addressed with the help of their counselor. It is extremely disappointing to see the lack of support on the part of the school administration in regard to these things.
Although this is not direct discrimination, many students are far too comfortable using racist and homophobic slurs. As an LGBT+ student, hearing my classmates constantly throw around the F slur and D slur is starting to take a toll on my mental health.
One teacher at American takes out his anger/frustration at students. One time, there was a student who spoke up for his classmates' right to see a counselor, and the teacher took that student outside to talk to him. We heard the teacher pounding the wall, and he didn't come back in the room for a while. The whole class was often wary of what mood he might be in as a result. People tend to be scared to ask a question or talk to him because he sometimes talks down to students and makes them feel incompetent. That being said, there are times when he is supportive and understanding of students. I only wish that he was the latter all the time. Otherwise, it can feel hypocritical.
There's a teacher who shames students to an excessive extent. She made one student stand in the corner and face the wall for goofing around a bit. Another time, one student was giving another student money during a passing period. They weren't being suspicious or anything, but then the teacher made a big scene out of it. She had a long talk with each student and nearly accused them of selling drugs to each other. She also said it was, quote, common sense, end quote, to not give money to another student during the passing period. She then had to tell the whole class, making an issue out of nothing. I could tell the student was embarrassed out of the scene being made.
I'm so emotionally unavailable and can't process any emotions properly, and no one at American can understand. I struggle with the concept that other people can feel things that I can't. Thus, I resort to reading fan fiction to keep myself sane and to understand feelings properly. I'm so deprived of a father that I had to create a fantasy that my male English teacher was my father. I may be a sociopath, and I don't know how to deal with it.
AHS has for far too long refused to hold teachers accountable. I had a certain history teacher who graded extremely unfairly, often humiliated and made fun of students in class, promoted ableist policies, manipulated students for fun, and pushed their opinions onto students to be accepted as facts. Being in that class was a nightmare. My mental health plummeted as a result of trying to maintain my GPA in the face of this teacher's irrational grading policies, as well as trying to avoid being picked on in front of the whole class. When my parents saw the damage and toll it was taking on me emotionally, they went to the counselors and administration in the hopes that they could help us. However, not only did we not receive any help, we were brushed off with simple comments of, quote, that teacher is a great teacher, end quote, and, quote, there's nothing we can do, end quote. The administration completely ignored my experiences and chose to gaslight instead. That whole school year was very tough for me, and I had more breakdowns than I can count. I am extremely frustrated that the admin consistently chooses to protect problematic teachers instead of listening to students. I went into that class wanting to learn new things, but all I ended up doing was memorizing the teachers' opinions on every little thing to avoid getting on their bad side. As an alumni, I'm grateful for the memories from this school, but I've been left with a very negative impression of the administration. Do better, American.
I only want the best for my siblings and for future students at FUSD. From my 4 years in the school district and the experiences of my younger peers this past online quarter, I am very saddened. In this time in Fremont, California, your students, your children, your teachers deserve so much better. In the midst of a pandemic, adapting to the educational and mental health needs of students and teachers is key to the future of all California communities. The school board, the parents, the superintendent, and local to federal government should work together to rebuild our severely defunded and broken public school systems. I bring up the systemic problems instead of my own suffered abuse because you already failed me, and we the students know it is so hard for you all in the system to change unless you get bad press or your own families are affected. Do better and address all these pressing problems in the midst of a deadly long-term pandemic. The future generations are ready to be taught well. Refund and reform your education.
I have long struggled with mental health issues, which were only exacerbated by my experiences at AHS. I never thought I was good enough or worthy of the care and attention my family gave me, a feeling that I was mostly able to suppress until I arrived in high school. As the classic all-honor student, I was surrounded by peers whose only concern seemed to be grades and teachers who did little to prevent their classroom environments from being toxic. A few teachers indeed actively contributed to this environment through their actions. I had a teacher who had a habit of physically positioning themselves way too close to students without their knowledge, sometimes placing their hands on the hands of students, including my own, without prior consent. I also had a teacher who had a tendency to talk down to their students, treating us as if we were clueless kindergarteners rather than high school students deserving of dignity and respect. The same teacher would create tension and distrust between their classes by leveling blanket punishments against one class because of complaints from another one of their classes that some of their materials had been stolen/damaged. Another one of my teachers was prone to explosive outbursts of anger at minor student infractions, including one instance when I honestly forgot to staple two parts of my test together and was berated loudly for being a quote, stupid kid, end quote. As if I had not felt worthy before, these instructors affirmed my belief that I was simply not good enough to deserve wellness and happiness. I truly believe that the overwhelming majority of educators teach because they enjoy interacting with and helping students in their academic journeys, and I fully appreciate all the wonderful teachers that I have had at AHS. However, the few bad apples that have negatively affected my learning experience by causing me undue stress and anxiety should themselves at least receive additional training on how their actions are harmful and detrimental to young developing minds like mine.
I was stalked for 3 years by a fellow student. He followed me between classes, joined extracurricular activities to be close to me, and gave me unsolicited tokens of romantic affection. Worse, he wrote me threatening letters saying that he wanted to hurt a male friend of mine, whom he perceived as a rival. I showed these letters to the administration, but they told me they couldn't warn my friend because it would violate my stalker's privacy. Additionally, teachers relied on me to manage my stalker's meltdowns. At least once, when he was clearly emotionally unstable, a teacher left him unsupervised with me and a group of other students. I had to physically insert myself between him and a fellow student to keep him from punching that student. Teachers passed by during the following meltdown, which involved him screaming profanities and punching a wall, but they ignored my gestures for help. After 3 years, I asked the administration to tell my stalker to stop trying to court me. A couple days later, I got a call from the police, who warned me not to go anywhere alone, since my stalker had become enraged and threatened me. Nonetheless, the administration continued to encourage me to feel sympathy for him, telling me that I was, quote, the sun in his sky, unquote, and that the entire mess was very, quote, Romeo and Juliet-like, unquote. I guess they didn't consider that in the supposedly romantic tragedy, Juliet ends up dead.
One of my teachers displays mentally abusive behaviors. He specifically speaks so quiet that it's inaudible, then yells at students, takes them outside, and bangs lockers while hollering at them. I'm honestly terrified of him.
I'm not sure whether or not this story would fit into this category, but here it goes. I was borderline gaslighted. That or my friends were just way too toxic. I don't know where it went wrong, and that friendship messed me up so bad I thought it was my fault. The day I found out was harder on me since I started noticing a month prior, but I didn't realize it until after. They treated me like trash, and I am still healing from this horrible experience. I still don't know what it was, but from this experience I now have so many more issues with my mental health. Luckily I did find some good friends. I just wanted to share the story, although it happened a year ago. It's still something that lingers with me.
Male PE teachers need to learn that calling boys, quote, girls, end quote, as an insult when they run slowly / don't move quick enough is not only incredibly sexist, but also perpetuates an unnecessary ideal of toxic masculinity. Enough is enough. I have seen this happen in both Thornton and American.
One of our substitutes consistently used microaggressions every single time she appeared as a substitute teacher. She would accuse me and other Asian students of, quote, not talking right, unquote, literally stating, quote, these people and their kids don't talk right, unquote. As a younger high school student, I felt like this was about race, but I couldn't explain why. I just intuitively knew that this was racially charged. It wasn't until I read books for APANG that I realized that the term for these experiences are, quote, microaggressions, end quote.
My teacher consistently called Indians, quote, smelly, end quote, and forced students to discuss open defecation and treat it as the, quote, primary topic, end quote, of discussion of the country. It was really uncomfortable and made me realize how deeply rooted racism against Asians is in our community. This teacher also promoted the racist theory on Facebook that part of Indian culture is men being misogynistic towards women. It is highly inappropriate for a teacher who teaches mostly Indian students to hold such ignorant views about Indian people.
Maybe people didn't treat me the same since I'm Middle Eastern. They would make fun of certain features I had, such as my nose or hair, because they were different than most students at American.
Throughout my time at American, I've been subject to several racial microaggressions from my peers. I've been called derogatory racial terms, which I don't want to disclose because they'll reveal my race, several times, made fun of on the basis of racist stereotypes, and have had several objectifying remarks made about my appearance on the basis of race. This behavior is continually normalized at American, and it needs to be addressed.
I was lucky enough to not have experienced any racial, sexual/religious harassment while at AHS. However, there should be some discussion with certain staff members on how to respectfully talk to students. I have had the unfortunate experience of working with specific staff members who were rude, made curt comments, acted impatiently, and disregarded what students had to say. These interactions happened more than once over the span of 4 years, so it was by no means an isolated incident, and it gave me, and many of my peers, a poor experience being forced to work with these individuals. It would greatly improve the relationship between staff and students if more respect was given when talking to students.
While walking in PE, a guy in my class came behind me and pulled my hair. The reason he gave for doing it was that I must like it, referring to it in a sexual way and then pulling my hair again.
During my sophomore year, while exiting the doors of our multi-purpose room after one of our annual rallies, a male student started grabbing me from under my skirt. No one saw him, as everyone was much too occupied with trying to exit the gym doors as quickly as possible. As an attempt to get him to stop, I elbowed him anywhere that I could, but as discreetly as possible since I didn't want to make a scene. But his hand remained there, grabbing and feeling around even more than it was before. After that encounter, I started wearing more, quote, less revealing, unquote, clothing, such as hoodies and leggings, which honestly didn't stop the sexual harassment from other men that passed by me on my way home from the bus stop, nor did it help with my self-esteem after experiencing something like that. It's been approximately a year and a half, and I haven't really told anyone about this experience, with the exception of my closest friends, but none of my family members, because I felt that if I opened up about it, people would see me as an attention seeker. In addition, I didn't know who he was. I didn't remember his face nor much of his physical features, and honestly, even if I did, I felt that no one would really do anything about it anyways. I felt that the authorities at our school would give him a simple slap on the wrist and call it a day.
I had a body part inappropriately touched at a track meet by a former AHS student who justified his actions by saying he had, quote, mistaken me for someone else, end quote. Either way, that's pretty screwed up.
At American, I have faced sexual harassment from my peers and 2 male teachers. My peers have made obscene comments about the size of my breasts and buttocks. I have been sent unsolicited penis pictures and sexualized constantly since Thornton. When I tried to talk to my friends about it, I was told to, quote, take it as a compliment, end quote. 2 male teachers who are still employed at American also made me extremely uncomfortable by blatantly scanning my body, especially certain parts, and not stopping even when I made eye contact. I was always too scared to tell them to stop, so instead I started bringing a blanket to school to cover myself in certain periods. One of the male teachers mentioned also gave my friend an unsolicited massage on her arms when he overheard her telling a friend how sore she was from her previous day's sports practice. The same male teacher also once went out of his way and took an unnecessary long route around the classroom to force himself to squeeze up against me while he passed me as I was signing out for a bathroom pass.
I faced countless remarks made about my body, appearance, and face. These remarks tend to sexualize and harass me on occasions where the participants would gather in a private classroom setting and communicate about females' bodies, mainly me. This continued for the rest of the year without any help from the teacher. She stayed quiet and told me to, quote, forget about it, end quote. At one point, it had gotten so out of hand that the boys started to call me names such as effing H word, the L word, and many more derogatory terms. They openly commented on how they imagined sleeping with me and using sounds like moaning and screaming to phase my concentration. That was our last public comment. So we will now take a 5-minute break where the panelists can take a moment to digest what you just heard. Anusha, can you share screen the timer, please? Thank you.
Yes, and we will reconvene at approximately 3:40, so sit tight.
Panelists, feel free to turn off your video for the 5 minutes. You can turn it back on when we come back.
All right, that marks the end of the 5 minutes. If all the panelists, oh, yeah, looks like almost everyone has their cameras on already, so that's great. All right, so we're now back. We'll be taking approximately the next hour and 20 minutes or so to discuss these student testimonies and steps we can take as a community to prevent occurrences similar to those referenced in the stories from happening in the future. And a note to our panelists, you are by no means constrained to provide a specific answer to each question when responding, as we want to give you the space to tell us about how you are processing the students' stories, perhaps your personal experience with these issues, and any and all things that you see fit to include to make this discussion as productive and open as possible. So with that, we will go to the first guiding question about ableism. And that is, how can students and staff take action to prevent the exploitation of students with disabilities and the trivialization of their conditions?
Would brainstorming be an appropriate activity here? So I don't have a definitive answer, but I've got some ideas that are coming to me. Is this an appropriate forum for that?
Yes, if the brainstorming you feel would be a meaningful addition to our discussion, then by all means feel free to.
I'm sure there are people with more specific suggestions that maybe I should have let go first, but one of the things that strikes me in many of these stories is that when students try to go public with the problems they had, or at least try to speak to those with authority, nothing was done. And one thought I have is the idea of, I got this from reading Robert Reich's book on the common good. And one of the elements of a healthy society is the application, and this is going to sound strange, of shaming, but public shaming, but not shaming against an individual. For example, I'm just thinking, this is brainstorming. I'm thinking that in the case of when there's some harassment going on, maybe there could be an administrative announcement just saying anonymously that there have been cases of harassment that have been reported lately, and we're looking into them. We want to let you know that we take these things seriously, and anyone who's experiencing these things should be confident that we'll follow up on them. Problem is, it seems like students felt like their complaints went into, a hole in the ground. And maybe if there was an occasional, this is who we are and this is who we aren't message coming across as a matter of course, I don't know if that would ever be something that would be of value.
Yeah, thank you. Trustee Jones?
One of the concerns that I have, especially when it comes to our students with special needs, is about prevention. We don't want kids to get to high school and to face these things. And I think part of what we need to do as a district is do a better job at expanding our full inclusion program that starts in preschool and elementary school. I think when students that have special needs are included early and students are surrounded by them, and that promotes a culture that is different than when we have students that are sent to specific schools where there is a special day program. For instance, when my own children were attending elementary school, there wasn't a special day program at their school. So any of the students in our attendance area who were special needs were not at our home school, were not mainstreamed with general ed students. And I think when that happens, when you get to, say, high school, where the students are back on campus, they seem foreign to some of the general ed students. They haven't been part of the community for long enough. And I think that's something that we can look at as a district. It's been one of my goals to expand that full inclusion program so that our special ed students feel like an integral part of the community, and our gen ed students recognize them as an integral part of the community, where they've been, making friends with these students from the time they were young, instead of, having something happen like what we're seeing now.
Thank you. Ms. Howell?
As a classroom teachers, I think we need to be the first one to show the appreciation of their condition. It's like we show our appreciation about who each individual students is and are. So when the person in authority or on stage embrace and appreciate and view their condition as part of, just like who I am too. I have my strength, I have my weakness. So I think as a classroom teacher, you need to be mindful of these kind of things and then make a conscious decisions, but do it so skillfully, no one else noticing you actually are doing it for students to facilitate the classroom culture. And the example I read in the comments there, I think I saw a few times there were some students dancing or feel free to make some movement in a rotunda. So I recall the incidents, but at the time, because I myself fully appreciate them from the heart, therefore I truly appreciate that dance. And I feel like so happy at American High, my students feel free to dance. But I certainly learned from a different perspective from the letters that, oh, that's right. As a staff, we also need to be aware, not everybody look at the same events or behavior the same way that we each individual looked at. So I appreciate the letter as well.
Thank you. Ms. Singham?
Hi. What Ms. Howell said resonates with me completely. And I wanted to add that people respond really well through stories. I find when I listen to a story, my heart, that touches my heart, something compassion comes out of me, right? Towards anybody who's feeling pain. So, and this is true for all of us. If we can share stories that brings out the compassion in everyone around us, that will make a huge difference. And I remember reading a really beautiful novel from the point of view of an autistic kid, a teenage autistic kid. I cannot remember the name of the novel right now, but I will dig around and search for it. But something like that could actually become a text for an English class, where lots of in-depth discussion could happen around the topic of autism, for example. And it could suddenly open up everyone's understanding of what it means to be in the shoes or in the skin of somebody who is autistic, for example, and look at the world from that point of view. And when you're able to see somebody else's perspective, there's no chance for compassion to not come out there. It will naturally come out. All of us are innately compassionate if we have those opportunities that bring it out. So we should just bring opportunities to our students to allow the compassion to come out, and to all our staff.
Thank you. Ms. Noss?
I wanted to kind of build off Trustee Jones's point of, I've actually spent a lot of time talking with the class of 2021 about inclusion and the need to bridge the gap between special ed students and be more accommodating and go and make them feel part of the school, because there's such separation. For a lot of them, they don't necessarily get invited to the class events or the sporting events or go to dances, and that inclusion is to me a huge thing of making more of a well-rounded high school experience rather than just kind of being segregated. Because I do remember having grown up in Fremont and going to Centerville, the example about the student dancing that occurred when I was in when I was at Centerville, and I just remember feeling that it was yes, he was doing it because he thought it was a positive thing, but you could tell from the student point of view, it wasn't taken that way necessarily. And those trends over time is kind of unnerving to still see being done.
Thank you. Have Ria and then Mr. Rodriguez after her, and then I think we'll move on to the next question.
I kind of wanted to like address like more of the story specifically that we had on ableism, because as a student, I think one thing that would be quite useful is like education on how to identify signs of exploitation specifically, and how we can know like when someone is actually being exploited. And like I understand like in a rotunda it's often really crowded, and maybe staff and admin doesn't get a chance to see like everything that we as students can see. But I think like with the proper education and tools to how to like handle exploitation, I think that we'd be able to like better protect our special ed students as well.
Thank you. Mr. Rodriguez?
I think we need to have a little bit more of what was said before. We need to have more inclusion, but we just don't talk about the student, or we talk about ourselves. I think we need to bring in more people into the students' lives. Like, not a lot of people know that if Scott Fitzgerald was dyslexic. A lot of people don't know that. But if we can bring these opportunities to the students, showing other people who may have some sort of disability, but be successful, bring those stories to the classroom, show that it is normal, that this is life. This is how it should be included, not a separate thing where we go, oh, it's a mental health challenge, it's a physical health challenge. No, it should just be taught that it's accepted. That's how we do. We're all different, they're different as well. But if we can bring people, or bring stories like what was mentioned before, or bring other opportunities where it's shown that these people are successful, maybe that could help bridge the gap, instead of just, like I said, waiting for a student to come in and then taking that opportunity to explain it. Why should we wait till then? We should just have it incorporated maybe in the beginning of the school year, especially for freshmen coming in, because we've already recognized that there may be a problem with the lower grades coming up. Maybe freshman year, we just attack it and say, hey, we want you to understand that this is what's going to happen. This is our community and we accept it.
Thank you very much for that. Bella, you want to take it away now?
Now we'll be moving on to the next topic. Our next guiding question is, how can we most effectively bridge the gap of understanding between AHS community members of opposite sexes and genders, focusing specifically on interactions between male teachers and female students? Isaiah?
Yeah, I was going to give the same comments for the last question, but I think it actually applies perfectly well. And I think I definitely agree with Ms. Sangam and Mr. Krieger about how more compassion and more education for the staff is key. But at least with my experiences at AHS, those things don't really work if you don't have enforced accountability. And I think it's good that we're talking about this, and it's good to petition on the local level, or as a student or as a concerned parent. But some of those things about how FUSD is structured, it starts at the top, and us critically thinking about how we approach teacher and student interactions, and also how, if we validate the concerns of those students who bring it up, as others have brought up. So I just want to quickly posit that enforced accountability should be at the front of our minds, and that we shouldn't be worried about protecting teachers, but we should be worried about healing these relationships and not holding people accountable. It's not black and white.
Thank you for that, Isaiah. And Ms. Roman?
This is more of a question, probably. And in professional world, most of us have to undergo discrimination training, which is inclusive of sexual interactions. Discrimination of gender, sex, all of that at work. Is such training provided to teachers? And also, should we be having those kind of training for students as well, and not in high school, slightly earlier than that, maybe in the junior high, to explain to them how these interactions happen, should happen, what is acceptable, what is not acceptable. And the other thing is, it could also be culturally different based on some of the culture, the interactions are different. And being in Fremont, which is very diverse, we need to take that into account as well. So is such training provided for teachers? Should we provide if we don't have? And we should also think about doing it for students as well.
Thank you. Trustee Jones?
Well, I think we all recognize that a high school environment is not insular. We are part of a larger community and a larger culture. And when there are things like systemic racism and systemic sexism as part of the wider culture, it's not surprising, though it is disheartening, to see that play out in a school environment, in a high school environment in particular. I think what we really need to do as an educational institution is we have an opportunity either to keep perpetuating the problems that we see in society or disrupting them. And that's really what we need to do. And I think the challenge when you're trying to disrupt something that is such a systemic problem in our culture is that you have to be really, really deliberate about it, because it is so easy for, since this is focused on sexism a little bit, the question, since sexism is so ingrained, sometimes it happens and you don't even recognize what it is. Just as an example, I grew up in the 80s, and some of the classic 80s movies that were part of my upbringing, I wanted to share with my kids when they became teenagers. And when we sat down to watch some of these movies, I was stunned at how offensive they were and how sexist they were, and disheartened that I didn't recognize that when I was younger. And that, I mean, my kids were looking at me like, what is going on, Mom? How is this okay? So I think our generation, we really need to take a look at the ingrained attitudes that we have and figure out ways to disrupt those so that we don't keep perpetuating that. But it's going to take really deliberate effort, training for staff, and more education for students.
Thank you for that, Trustee Jones. Would anyone like to add anything, or should we move on to the next guiding question? Ms. Barrington?
Thank you. I think, a huge part of this resonates with me. My very first job in high school, I was working at Knott's Berry Farm in Southern California. And I got the job on my 16th birthday because I was so ready to have my own money. But my experiences with that were that I had a very sexist boss, and actually he was fired within a year for the behavior that he exhibited towards the female employees. And my upbringing was always very supportive for women, and I hadn't faced it on that great of scale. And so I'm always very sensitive to these reports of sexist behavior, and a lot of what we heard in the testimonies was not just behavior that should be brushed off or brushed aside. It's behavior that I wish I knew about, and I wish that we had. And I think as a result of a lot of this sharing, we need to create a system for students to share their stories, and we need to make sure that those who are feeling like their story isn't important enough to share, or they're feeling like it's not going to be treated seriously, that we do dispel those beliefs, and I do want to hear what they're experiencing on campus. And going back to what Mr. Krieger kind of started us off with in terms of sharing what's happening, and I know that Fremont has a very specific policy of following through with complaints, but I'm happy to address concerns with staff members when they're reported. It doesn't need to be public shaming, but there does need to be a conversation about behavior that's inappropriate and appropriate consequences taken from that. And I do want to make sure that that I'm clear that a follow-up from hearing all of these stories for me is that we need to create a system for students to report their stories.
Thank you, Ms. Barrington. Dr. Hernandez?
I kind of wanted to dovetail on Trustee Jones's emphasis on intentionality, and especially within this particular question, how men are to be intentional in their dealings with women, period. This is not, and this is my first year at American. We went through the Me Too movement, which is still ongoing. And one of the things that I did was to discuss this with the male students and to make sure that the conversation was not necessarily excluding women, but it was a conversation that men had to have with other men. And that if men are the primary beneficiaries of gender bias, sexism, and patriarchy, it is up to men to make those changes. So I was kind of wanted to maybe focus on having those sorts of conversations with the other men on campus. And I know how difficult it was for me my first year, sort of establishing male-on-male relationships with other colleagues because of some of the commentary, because of some of the things that were being said. And it was something that I would come home to my wife and discuss, because this was not something I was used to, coming from a more urban environment that was more geared towards dismantling social hierarchies in Oakland. So it was kind of interesting to see how even the culture among the faculty was also extremely supportive of sexism, gender bias, and these sorts of ideas. And it's something that I continue to work on. It's something that needs to be extremely intentional. It's something that I'm not afraid to say that I hold extremely patriarchal and sexist values that I have to look at and examine every single day, that my wife and daughters are check me all the time on. And it's that sort of thing that that sort of intentionality that needs to be purposeful. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Dr. Hernandez. Ms. Barwani and then Mr. Krieger, and we can move on after.
Thank you. Yeah, I also wanted to kind of dovetail on Trustee Jones and also Dr. Hernandez now, but I think that something that Trustee Jones touched on was, teaching things from a very young age as well. And I think we have to remember to teach not only what is inappropriate, but what is appropriate. And, not just the negative side of things, but how to, how appropriate interactions, but also for those who have experienced negative interactions, what consent really is, consent of bodies, and making sure that even at a very young age, and I think that this is not just for girls, that people understand, that young kids understand what they, that they really should be the ones who are deciding who touches them. And it could be something even really innocuous, but it's really important for people to understand that and to grow up with that understanding. And I think that unfortunately, girls are often also taught in society and in social media that the messaging is that it's not that big of a deal. Just get over, move on. This happens all the time. And, the stories really indicated, I think, that people felt like nothing would be done, or that they reported something and they still felt like nothing was done. And so I think that this is something that is also perpetuated on a societal level, and it's something that we really, really need to address from much earlier than high school. And so, yeah, that was all I wanted to share. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Mr. Krieger?
Yes, two quick comments. The first one connects back to Ms. Barrington and I think Ms. Nahigian. I looked in the book that I was referring to, the book Robert Reich, The Common Good. And there's alongside the shaming idea, there's the honor idea. So the whole concept is honor and shame. And and I think Miss Barwani, I should have said, was referring to that we have to teach them what's honorable too, as well as if we decide, however public we decide to go with, shaming and honor, heroes and zeros is another way to put that. But also my second comment really was moved by Dr. Hernandez's comment about the willingness to deal with problematic attitudes and behavior with the kind of humility that he was talking about, when you honoring your own areas to grow and being willing to show students that you yourself are growing, and to teach with that kind of humility. I thought that was a beautiful comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Krieger. And with that, we'll move on to our next point of discussion, which is how do we combat gender norms and normalize the use of pronouns? More specifically, how can we aid students in the LGBTQ+ community against the harassment that they often face? Ms. Howell?
I think I raised a hand for the previous one, but I think two questions are sort of related in gender in a way. I was gonna say, as a female growing up, yes, I went through many of negative experiences as well. And I felt the same way, nothing could have been done. Why would I need to take actions? So we learn to survive. But one thing I really want to share with whoever is going through the same things, okay, you need to find somebody who you can trust and learn how to heal and learn how to protect from this point on as well. That protect is not blame on yourself for what has happened. It just things ever since the world was created, bad things happen, but does not mean we can accept it. And we need to first condemn it. Second, learn how to prevent it and protect ourselves and heal from it as well. So as a classroom teachers, I feel short on how I can do. So maybe professional development would be helpful for me, because this is more of a personal level. And that would be my expressions of, yes, I feel short on if I would really have to help students, I would appreciate to be trained on how to support if I have a girl coming in and let me know, but it's not at the level I have to report to police or anybody, but it's just seeking out help, seeking out for advice, or they're perceiving this is attack, but nothing happened yet. So a lot of this kind of things could be a training for staff, how to support our students when situation arise too. So there's a big scale, like people already mentioned. There's also a one-on-one scale of the training that it will be very helpful personally for me as a profession here, having the opportunity to help students who potentially are victims.
Thank you, Ms. Howell. And also, Senor Navarrete just joined. Would you mind introducing yourself really quickly?
Yes, hi everyone. My name is Mr. Navarrete. I teach Spanish and I'm the chair of world languages. I apologize, I'm late. I was in another meeting.
No worries. Thank you for joining us today. Currently, we're discussing how can we aid students in the LGBTQ+ community against the harassment that they often face. More specifically, how do we combat gender norms and normalize the use of pronouns? Anusha, would you like to go, since we haven't heard that many student voices?
Yeah, sure. I'm gonna touch more specifically on normalize the use of pronouns. I think a really easy way we can do that is just by putting it in our Zoom names. Like since we're on Zoom for what looks like to be a majority of the school year this year, I think that is the best way to normalize it. And then maybe teachers and admin can enforce this. Maybe teachers can tell their students to also put their pronouns in their Zoom names. That way there's no confusion and people will feel more respected.
Thank you, Anusha. And Ms. Noss?
Almost started talking without pushing that unmute button. Really get you. So I hear Anusha's point, and I think it is like while on Zoom, yes, having the preferred pronoun is definitely a positive, but I think for me as a teacher, I will struggle with understanding or feeling comfortable enough right off the bat the first week of school to ask students what their preferred pronouns are, because there may be people in class or I just don't know how to approach it as like a topic of conversation. And that's probably a part on me of wanting to be sensitive to other students that may not feel as comfortable. And I also hesitate to like forcing all students to do it as well. But I recognize the importance in the striving to do it. But I think I lack the knowledge or comfort of how to implement it after Zoom when we go back into the classroom. And I can recognize about my own limitations with moving forward in a direction like that.
Thank you, Ms. Noss. I think Anusha, raise your hand again in response, and then.
Yeah, Ms. Noss, you bring up a very good point of people maybe not be comfortable with sharing their pronouns like right off the bat. I think a solution to that was actually my English teacher. They sent out a survey at the beginning of the school year, not anonymous, one that the responses would just be clear to them. And maybe if the student isn't comfortable with sharing their pronouns, the survey could have an option like, sorry, like I'm not comfortable at this time. When and if I am comfortable at a later point, I will share that information with you. And then, sorry.
Oh, no, continue.
Okay, so, and you also bring up another good point about this being implemented after, or hopefully when we do resume in-person classes. I think the same survey could be sent out still, and if they would like that to be present when they choose to speak in class, or their classmates could have access to that, then I think that would also be a good solution.
Thank you, Anusha. Trustee Jones?
So I think it's probably not a surprise to some of you, but maybe news to others that I have children in the LGBTQ community, and my oldest is transgender. And uses they, them pronouns. So I know, personally how challenging it can be to adjust and adapt to new pronouns. And even for somebody who is a supportive parent of a trans person, getting used to that, using that they, them pronoun in the singular was tough for me. So I understand that it can be challenging for folks, but I think one of the things that's a particular challenge for our LGBT students is that many of them don't necessarily have supportive families. And when they're experiencing harassment on campus, they're afraid to report it because they don't want to be outed to their families in particular. And so I think one of the things we have to be really clear with our students about is that they have privacy rights, is that California law protects the privacy of LGBT students in particular. And if they are out at school and do not want their parents to know, the school has a responsibility to protect their privacy with their identity, even to a parent. And so our students need to know, our LGBT students need to know that if they report harassment at school, they will not be outed to their parents, to their families, if that is something that's not safe for them. Which, you know, it makes me sad to think that's the case anywhere, but it is, and it is the case here in Fremont at times. And we also need to make sure we're training our staff to understand those laws as well, so that our staff is protecting the privacy rights of those students and making sure that they remain safe at school and at home, if that would be a problem for them. And I know several years ago, it was probably 2 years ago, staff went through gender spectrum training, which I think was very helpful, and from what I heard was well received. But I think that kind of training needs to not be a one and done. That is something that needs to happen periodically, because we have turnover with staff. We have changes in administration. So we need to make sure that when we train our staff, not just about this, but about any of these things, restorative justice, cultural sensitivity, that we're not just doing it once and thinking, okay, we're good now. We have to have systems in place to where we periodically refresh that training for our staff, and just making sure our students know that what their privacy rights are, especially when it comes to reporting this type of harassment and bullying.
Thank you, Trustee Jones. Mr. Rodriguez would like to speak very briefly, and then afterwards, Dr. Hernandez can speak.
Thank you. I think we need to have, and we're going to say this throughout the meeting, we need to have direct intent. We need to find where we're going with this, and we need to have a lot of inclusion. This is similar to other groups that are being excluded. So I think it just has to start somewhere. And I think we need to listen, as we're going to talk about with every group. But I think we can start by identifying just with ourselves that we are open to it. So by changing and identifying our pronouns, or making them aware, like it was brought up, how do we do it when we come back? Well, let's be open about it. Let's let the students know that we're open, we're listening to them, that we are part of the safe place that needs to be provided to them, instead of just shutting our door and saying they're going to have to deal with it, or I don't know them, so I'm not going to talk to them. We can have people that are identified as safe places. That we're going to talk about it again with the other issues we have, but if we can just identify, I know I would put something out, I would put something in my door, I'm not even worried about it, just to let somebody know that this is a safe place for them to come. Because honestly, when we went through things, it just broke my heart. So if it just means that I'm going to listen, whether I don't know about it, whether I disagree with it or not, but if just me listening is making us as this community better, I'm all for it. Open up my door, come in, talk to me anytime. But I think if we do that around the campus, if we can just let people know that there are people on this campus that are willing to listen and be on your side, just identify it publicly, I think then it would grow, because then again, we're going to normalize that. But it's got to start somewhere. And we can start with me. I could be the only one on campus. I don't even care. But just going through this is just breaking my heart that these students don't feel like they have a place to go because they're worried about being criticized for how they feel. I'm open to anything, but I will publicly display anything I need to publicly display to let those kids understand that they have a place to come and be safe. That's my piece. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rodriguez. I think Mr. Krieger gave you a clapping hands emoji too, in backing up. Dr. Hernandez and then Ms. Sangam.
So part of this, as a social science teacher, I think that it would be important to teach queer theory, to sort of approach and sort of normalize all of this, kind of really look at what are the academic ways to address these issues, and talk about what normativity is, talk about what intersectionality is, talk about how what gender theory, like sort of really approach these issues, and make it normal to discuss them, and also to broaden the students' horizons and kind of look at queerness from many different ways, and to see queerness as normal, right? To take away the strangeness of queerness. And I think it's important for students. One of the things to kind of dovetail on Mr. Rodriguez's suggestion of kind of openly displaying safety. In Oakland, we had safe space badges on our ID. So basically you would have a space badge on your ID and you carry it with you and you walk around with it, as students know that they can approach you on these issues. But it's also in the issue of the question of normalizing. I think it's also important for students to see that what queer might look like. It might be different, so that you can be cis male and you can be in a heterosexual relationship and you can have all of the accoutrements of a particular type of male presentation, and you might still see yourself as non-binary. You might see, so like how presentation or how a person might hold on to their particular identity at any given time is not necessarily always on their sleeve. And I think that's really important. And one of the things that I like to do is to discuss queerness openly and sort of provide that idea that, you can be married, have a PhD, present as male, and still be queer. Queerness doesn't have a particular look, that there's a lot of ways of being queer in the world.
Thank you, Dr. Hernandez. Ms. Sangam, and then Ms. Noss.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to what Trustee Jones was saying. I think she made a lot of really important points about how children feel, whether they feel safe enough to share or not. We have to honor their privacy because they may not be feeling safe at home and all that. I also wanted to add, I too have a daughter who identifies as with the they, them pronouns. And it's not easy for me to adjust to those pronouns also. And she has a boyfriend and I should refer to him also as they. They also refer to my daughter with a they pronoun. And I have to think, oh, they're talking about my daughter. So it takes a little adjusting. But fortunately, my daughter doesn't get upset with me if I make a mistake. So it's all right. But I also wanted to touch base on this, on what Mr. Rodriguez said about being available to people on campus. I feel really blessed that students felt comfortable to come over to my classroom regularly to have lunch there where I would do things. The class door was always open. They would just come and hang out and just be there and talk to each other. Sometimes they would talk to me, sometimes not. I would have a guitar and some kids would come and play the guitar. It was just a nice, open, friendly environment. And then, 2 or 3 kids came out to me and said, hey, Ms. Sangam, they identified themselves in a particular way in the LGBTQ community. And, I had not even talked about such a topic. But what happened was I provided an environment, or at least I feel like I provided an environment where they felt safe with me. They felt they could trust me. And if you establish that relationship of trust in a classroom on a regular basis, people are just going to come and talk to you and feel comfortable talking to you. I think we just need to be able to do that. And why is it that we don't always do that? It's often because teachers are themselves very stressed. So it goes back to, if we can take care of our own mental health, if we take care of ourselves really, really well, we can be more available to other people. And, I'm fortunate I have a meditation and breathing practice that helps me. And there are things we can do to help with our students as well, to relieve their stress. But if the entire staff makes this a really important priority, we each take care of ourselves. And when we do, we can then more easily listen to other people. Because if we are not taking care of ourselves, Our mind is not going to be in the present moment when somebody else is talking to us. We're busy thinking of our own issues. And instead, if we can be completely present for someone else when they're talking to us, they know we're listening. They know we're making them feel valid in their, whatever they're saying is making them validated. And we're acknowledging their entire presence. And it can make a huge difference if we first start taking care of ourselves as staff members.
Thank you, Ms. Sangam. And finally, Ms. Noss, and then Ben can move on to the next topic.
First and foremost, I think one thing I've had a conversation with my family as of recently, we do have family members that use the pronouns they, them. And like Trustee Jones and Ms. Sangam have said, getting used to it is difficult, but it's that they're patient with us. We are actively trying to use that. And I think it's hard as a social studies teacher, and I think Dr. Hernandez kind of touched on this, is that for me, I think it's hard that we like to think of our society as being really progressive and that we've come so far, but we actually haven't in a lot of respects. And that like queer history is not in our textbooks. And like that is incredibly disheartening that their history is kind of just pushed aside and we don't address all portions of history. And so kind of touching on that, and this is maybe something for Dr. Hernandez and I as social studies department chairs, is there is actually a curriculum that is being developed in the Campbell Union School District across all subjects, including world history, US history, and talking to them, which my cousin actually designed it. And so talking to her and their department of how we can be more representative of our student body.
Thank you very much, Ms. Noss. With that, we'll be moving on to the mental health guiding question. It actually touched base upon this a little bit in your answer, Ms. Noss, about how things have changed in some respects and how things haven't changed, which is the theme of one of our next questions. How have the conversations about mental health changed from when you were growing up as compared to now? And why do you think students might struggle more with mental health now than in the past? And on top of that, when we're looking for solutions-oriented kind of answers, how can the AHS community start to remedy the issues with mental health? And some of the topics for this can include our environment's emphasis on academic achievement, bullying/misconduct by students and staff, and a hesitancy to seek out mental health assistance. But feel free to chime in about any and all relevant topics. So, Mr. Larson, would you like to answer first?
Sure, thank you. I've been impressed with everybody's dedication. Talking about mental health, when I grew up in Fremont in the late 80s and 90s, we didn't talk about it. I don't remember people saying I'm stressed or anything, but that wasn't because it wasn't there. I think we, or I should say rather, kids and adults at that time dealt with their stress. They maybe couldn't identify what it was, but they dealt with it in ways that were sometimes unproductive or damaging or unhealthy. There were suicides when I was growing up. Unfortunately, we haven't turned that corner. How can American as a community work on this? Prior to my current job, I was a high school principal here in Fremont. And what really got our school to turn around was data and looking at hard data. We'd have conversations with families and with our teachers and with administrators, and we'd say, something doesn't quite seem right with the kids. Well, we'd hear things, if they got good grades, if they were doing better in school, or if they had more to do, they wouldn't worry as much. But when we got the hard data that showed one that I cite often that showed, it asked the kids, is there an adult on campus that you could go to if you were in a crisis? The first time that question was asked, the percentage was incredibly low. You could have heard a pin drop in the room when we presented that information to teachers, because none of us in education want to be perceived as someone that kids can't or won't go to. So it caused us as a staff to look inside and go, what are we doing wrong? Or what can we do differently? That was a moment that really opened the community up to recognizing that, gosh, there is something that isn't quite right. And we have data to support it, because we have this survey that shows things are not well and who it's not well with and why it isn't working. And in Fremont, in Silicon Valley, we like data and we like surveys. And that really was the turning point for that school and community, which still has work to do, but has come a long way. So I think data would be something that would be really helpful for America.
Thank you. Ms. Kardakli.
I was born and raised in Turkey. And here's one of the Turkish cultural things. When someone asks you, how are you? You can just start talking about your day. And you just obligated to listen each other. So when I first moved to the States at the age of 22, I'm just walking on the streets of LA, and people were asking like, how are you? And I was just like literally stopping on the spot, and I started talking about my day. Then I learned quickly that I just need to say, oh, I'm good. How are you? And just pass along. So it's interesting, like there is like cultural changes, cultural differences, and that is totally normal. But what I believe is, as an educator, we need to provide our community with the tools, and we need to protect our own well-being and supporting others as well. Like Ms. Sangam was mentioning earlier, if we are not well, how are we going to serve others, right? And in order to do that, though, we need to know and learn the tools, and there are so many of them. Since there are so many of them, I believe that every tool is supposed to be available to the community, so people can try and find the right tool for themselves. And other part is in school grounds, in order to know what's going on, for students, for teachers, when they see something, they're supposed to say something about it too. Again, we all need to take care of each other. If we are seeing a student has been absent, consequently, they are like checked out, somebody needs to know about that student. And as admin, we cannot see everything. We cannot see everyone. And we need to identify and support at-risk individuals. And we need to do that immediately. Like whenever there are signs, we need to be aware of it, and we need to take actions.
Thank you. Ms. Barwani?
Yeah, so similar to a lot of the other issues and concerns that we've already talked about, I think just normalizing mental health as something that everyone should be aware of for themselves and for other people, I think is really important. You know, there's a stigma to just even, I feel like, the words mental health, and realistically there shouldn't be, because we should all be focusing on making sure that our own mental health is, you know, as good as we can have it. And I think that there's a lot of factors that go into that stigmatization, but it's just as important as physical health. And, you know, I use this example a lot when I'm talking with students, but if they had a physical ailment, if they had a broken arm, they would not just brush it off and decide that they don't want to get it treated. They would go get it casted. And, you know, if there's something going on with one's mental health, then we also need to address that and make sure that we are being supportive. I think that the factors that were addressed in the question, the high emphasis on academic achievement, bullying and misconduct, hesitancy to seek out mental health assistance, these are all things that I know that the counselors are always very, very concerned about. And so I think that they really involve addressing each one kind of individually, and that's probably a much larger conversation. But I think just the normalization that mental health is an important thing for everyone is really significant.
Thank you. Ms. Raman?
I'm going to, it's slightly longer answer, but I come from a culture where there is a lot of stress on academic achievements. And growing up, we were taught that if you show weakness in something, it's not considered mental health, it's a weakness in you that you're not able to rise up to the occasion and challenge yourself to do better. I come from that background. After I moved here almost 25 years ago, it's been revealing. I've learned myself. I've grown to understand that academic achievement is not the do all and the end all for everyone. It's not, there are other ways people can shine. And I think speaking from the parents' perspective, there are parents who still feel, even now, and we see that when they come to the PTSA meetings because they can talk to Ms. Barrington and ask her the questions, it's all oriented towards academics. What courses can my child take to do better in an SAT or get better grades? I think we also need to think about educating parents and to make them understand putting too much pressure on the child is not helping them in any way. They're just causing them to close themselves from opening up to their parents. I don't want my child to feel that I'm not there to listen to them. I want to make sure that other parents also understand. Be open. If your child says, I can't do it, it doesn't mean they don't want to do it. It could mean they have something else that's preventing them. Help them out. So I think apart from just teachers or students, we start to have this conversation in the larger community. And I think as part of the PTSA, that's one thing we do want to focus on, is to try and get parents to understand the stress that the children go through. It's just not easy. It's not easy being a teenager. It's not easy putting all that stress on them.
Thank you. Senor Navarrete?
Thank you. So also echoing what Priya has said, in the Latino community, mental health is not something that is really talked about. It's something that is sort of brushed under the table. And so I think just the fact that we're having these conversation and starting with identifying the stressors that students are under, and then moving towards how we can build the optimal environment for our students to be able to learn and to grow in a healthy way. We know that this generation is under a lot of stress to succeed, to achieve it, and that competition to get to university, while at the same time dealing with a variety of distractions with technology, with TV shows that deal with issues of mental health and suicide, and perhaps don't do a good enough job at providing resources or closing those topics in a healthy way. And so I think our question is, how can we continue taking or build a holistic approach to educating our students and create the most optimal environment for them to learn. We know from science that teenagers need approximately 9 hours and 15 minutes to sleep at night. We know that the teenage brain releases melatonin much later in the day. We know that when they wake up, they still have a lot more melatonin in their brain. So all of these things that we know about teenagers and that developmental stage, how can we adjust our practice to be able to support them and also provide outlets for them to seek that help and integrate mental health practices into our teaching practice as well.
Thank you. Next, we'll go to Jeffrey, and then because we have two more topics that we really want to touch on, we're going to move on after this. But thank you for everyone else who raised their hands wanting to participate. But yeah, Jeffrey.
So I really relate to what Miss Ramon said about like the parent reaching out to the student type thing. And as a student, I've definitely felt like the other side of it. Growing up, I come from like a rather conservative Asian family in the Bay Area, so it's pretty competitive. And I was always taught with the culture that like men don't cry, and like that that like education, like getting a good education is like your top priority and things like that. And it wasn't like, and like for most of my life, because of like these things, like I felt that my parents like perpetuated this. I never really felt like they were a safe place to go to for like my mental health. But it wasn't until recently, or not that recent, but like a while ago, I just broke down one night and I was just sobbing. And my mom came, and then she came to check on me. And then it was like in that moment where I felt like, oh, my mother is someone I can actually like trust with my mental health, even though she just says things like that. She's saying that like when she says that, she's saying in general, those are things that I should strive for. But like at the end, I could feel that like she actually felt that my mental health was one of the like most important things. And in that moment, I felt like, oh, I can really trust her. And I think this isn't just limited to like parents. Like the idea of like reaching out to a student or like teacher, like staff, like reaching out to anyone, making them feel like you want to listen to them will make them more likely to trust you and let them like open up more. Like I feel like we've talked a lot about people like spotting the issue, spotting like the signs of this, but like you don't have to spot it. You can like figure it out yourself. I feel like I've had a lot of friends who like recently I've started checking up on them. I'm like, oh, how are you like mentally? Like I'm actually here for you if you need it. And it's just that like I feel like when you do things like that, people are more likely to tell you the issues, and like from that you can actually help them rather than just being like a bystander. Like you're not necessarily a bystander, but like I feel like the impact you can make is greater when you're actually making the effort to reach out and figure out the problem yourself.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey. Bella?
Yeah, before we move on to our next topic of racial discrimination, I want to give like my 2 cents on this topic too. Ms. Ramon and Senior Navarrete brought it up about how mental health is tied to culture or ethnic groups. And I think that's a really important aspect to acknowledge about how mental health is really wrapped up in the intersectionality of a lot of things, such as like culture and race and sexuality and all these different things. And I feel like that's a really important thing to address when we're talking about mental health. I know for the open letter to Mission that initiated all of these forums across FUSD, it was talking about how teachers at Mission will often blame the parents of these students because they'll blame it on their race, they'll blame it on their culture for putting this pressure on their kids or not talking about mental health, when there is a certain element of truth. Of course, certain cultures or races have like large struggles in talking about these things openly, but I think a lot of it comes down to teachers are not willing, some teachers are not willing to reach out to their students personally. Like I know teachers will just blame the kids for taking like a bunch of APs. They'll say, you did this to yourself, don't cry to me. And it's really disheartening and difficult for us to feel like we belong. Like Jeffrey said, some students have trouble talking to their parents, and then teachers will shut them out equally. So it's like, where do we go after that? And then I feel like it's even worse when teachers are blaming the students' parents, or just they refuse to acknowledge certain cultural aspects or racial aspects of things that accompany mental health. Like for example, Indigenous communities, they suffer one of the highest suicide rates in the country. And there's a lot of historical reasons for that. And I feel like that's often ignored when we talk about mental health. I think especially like just America in general doesn't like to acknowledge the different cultural aspects of mental health. And I feel like if we want to remedy those issues, we have to acknowledge that too when we're trying to think about how we want to revise certain policies in the district or just at American specifically, especially with a community that has such a large number of like students of color. I feel like that's a really important aspect to acknowledge. And moving on from that, with our topic of racial discrimination, the questions that I'd like to pose to you guys is, what should AHS staff and students do to promote anti-racism on campus? And what are some steps that teachers specifically can take to make their classroom environment more inclusive and ensuring that they're teaching racially aware lessons? Senor Navarrete.
Thank you. I actually forgot to lower my hand. So I think like the other topics that we have discussed, it starts with education, right? How can we build a culture where all of our differences are not just acknowledged, but they're also celebrated, and taking opportunities throughout the school year to educate ourselves and our school community about the different races on campus. And I think also taking responsibility for ourselves, for our own, if we have any preconceived notions or any biases. I think, and this is something that we've discussed in AP Spanish, when we are able to interact with people who are different from us, who we may not fully understand, then we're able to build a bigger understanding and be able to empathize and find common ground. And then in turn, that can create a more positive and welcoming environment for all of our students. Again, I think if this is present in our school culture, present throughout our campus, and it's something that we build into our daily practice, I think it can really go a long way.
Thank you, Senor Navarrete. Jeffrey?
Sorry, I just forgot to lower my hand from the last question.
Oh, okay. Ria?
Yeah, I can go. I think like a lot of it stems from education, as we've kind of discussed. And in my English classes here, we were listening to a speaker talk about the harms of a single story and how that can how that can shape perspectives of certain cultures and societies in a way that isn't portraying like the full depth of what that culture is. And my English teacher, she assigned a project where we're encouraged to read books from other cultural authors in order to expand our understanding of the world. And I think like because so much of our education comes from a Eurocentric white kind of perspective, whether that be through like the white authors in our English curriculum or how our history is generally shaped from a Eurocentric standpoint, I think that teachers taking the extra step to encourage their students, or even I guess in a way requiring them to expand their knowledge of what different cultures can be, is a way to actually promote this racial understanding, because it all stems from education.
Thank you, Ria. Ms. Kardakli?
I believe we must assess the campus climate and students' sense of belongingness by climate surveys periodically. That way, we will be armed with data and we can develop the kinds of interventions to tackle the kinds of subtle racism, whichever students are facing at American high school. And also, we must ensure that all students receive the necessary support in advising, counseling, and other student services. So, and I believe that support we provide must be timely, relevant, and can reach the students, whether they are at home or on campus. Now, as an admin, I can see how hard it is to connect with the students and families and find out what their needs are during distance learning. but I know we are doing our best on that part. As a long-term educator, I taught for 15 years, and I know that in the classroom environment, in order for students to speak up and be themselves, they need to trust the teacher. So just making positive connections with all of our students are extremely important, and believing every student can and wants to be successful, because this is my third year as an admin, and unfortunately I have witnessed countless students thrive in a classroom where teachers see them accurately, and show that they are happy have them there. And in these classes, those students choose to sit in front of the class, take careful notes, and be happy. Then I have seen the same exact students in different classrooms, different teachers' classrooms, and they are just going to the last row, sitting all by themselves and not being participating. So I just see the difference, how the classroom environment is letting students grow. So that part is, I believe, extremely important to stop. I will start actually anti-racism on our campus. It starts in the classrooms.
Thank you, Ms. Kardakli. Mr. Rodriguez, and then Ms. Barwani.
I agree. It starts in the classroom. And I think part of that moving forward is acknowledging, admitting, identifying that there is a different standard for different types of people. Once we can identify that, once we can acknowledge that and say, yes, there is a mistake, there is a problem, we need to move forward, and we accept what the students have to say. How are we going to work through that? I think once we get to the kids, once we work with the kids and allow them to tell us how we are going to move forward, instead of telling them, I know there may be a situation and we may get through this together, and we collectively as adults are trying to figure this out. But I think if we go into the classroom and let them know, hey, we are going to figure this out. Yes, there are some problems, but we are going to figure this out. Because we all know that there's other people out there that may not think the way we do. We go through these classes and we are told to be creative. We are told to work with these kids. But when we do it personally, it often gets flagged as, well, that's the way they were raised. That's the way they think. And sometimes it's a little too forward. But I know if I look different and I did the same things, I would be an innovator. I would be in front of everybody else, telling everybody else how to do it. But if we can all admit that we need to move forward together, and that we are going to work to identify a way to get through it together and not exclude anybody. And I know I talked earlier about gender. I know I talked about identification. I told you the intent needs to be there, and I absolutely believe it. We need to be intentional with this racial discrimination and getting rid of it. We have to, because the more we talk softly about it, the more it's just going to stay there. And it just doesn't happen in the high schools. I know we're here in the high school, but we can start lower and we can go higher. We can go all the way through the district. We can try and go through the state. But until we collectively admit that there is something going on, and we admit that we do need the help of the future, then I think we can then start to get past it. But until we don't do that into our classrooms, we don't bring that in, I don't see it moving forward. I really don't. So we need to admit it collectively as a staff and with the students.
Thank you, Mr. Rodriguez. Ms. Barwani?
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with what Mr. Rodriguez said. I think intentionality is incredibly important here. As a community, I think we have to start with ourselves, and that's individually and collectively. I think that both aspects are really important. I'm speaking for myself, my thoughts, my words, my actions. I believe that we really need a constant, conscious awareness of just the systemic racism that has been so deeply embedded in society and then is embedded in my brain, right? And so we have to make sure that everything that we do, that we are really, really aware of how that might be impacting other people and how our thoughts and actions can contribute to the problems of racism. And so I think that that means being open to being uncomfortable about making mistakes, but also like understanding that the notion that if you aren't being overtly racist, then you're not contributing to the problem is wrong, right? That you have to, it's that might be a comfortable place for you to sit in, but that doesn't mean that you are doing anything to perpetuate anti-racism. And so it's really, really important, I think, that we all recognize that individually and collectively, that really if we aren't actively focusing on anti-racism, then we are perpetuating racism.
Thank you, Ms. Barwani. Kemi?
I think you all made really good points. And also, caveat, I graduated American 5 years ago. I graduated college last year and I live in DC, so I am very far removed from Fremont and American at this point. But when I did go, I think something like this would have definitely been helpful. But just to sort of underscore, I think what a lot of other people have said, I think anti-racism, especially in this point in time, has sort of become like a buzzword. Like it just means, okay, I'm not racist, right? Kind of like what Sarah said about not being overtly racist, but it actually means that you acknowledge that you can't be a bystander. You have to talk about it. And, it's not just enough to not be racist. And I also think it really does, there's a responsibility for teachers, especially white teachers, to acknowledge and understand that, this is a white supremacist country. Like, it's founded on, we enslaved Black people for 400 years. We've kicked indigenous communities out of their country. So this is where we live. And whatever your politics are, you turn on the TV. I mean, you look social media, like race is in front of us at every moment. And thinking about how that impacts your students, especially your students of color who, share specific identities where, this is their lives that they're scared of. So how that impacts how they show up in class, especially, in the midst of a pandemic when they're dealing with, whatever personal stuff they're dealing with at home. So that's important. And I think somebody touched on something that I thought was a great point, but especially like English teachers and history teachers, making it a priority to make sure that students don't leave high school without having read, a book from a Black author, or not having an understanding of, indigenous communities, or a deeper understanding of slavery that, goes beyond just the 2 chapters that we read in high school, is really important. So to end it off, I really do think it just comes with, it's important to be uncomfortable. It's important to confront things that are uncomfortable. You can't not talk about race in 2020. And I think it does a disservice to your students if you're just not honest. And pushing them to do the work and doing the work yourself. But that's my 2 cents.
Thank you, Kemi. Just a small note on the time that we have. It's currently almost 4:59. Our panel was originally intended to last until 5, but it seems that we're going to be going a bit over. If you have an issue with that, if that affects any of your other appointments, please just message me or Benjamin in the private chat. And so moving on, Dr. Hernandez.
So I'll try to keep my my comments brief because due to time. This is something that is incredibly that hits home for me. This is not something that exists outside of who I am as a person, as a brown man in America, as a person of mixed race ancestry, as a person who comes from the Caribbean and can trace both those who were enslaved and those who did the enslaving. In my lineage, this is incredibly important. And the point I make is that we cannot outsource anti-racism. to kind of dovetail on what's been said, we can't anti-racism as existing of our daily practice. And I would push even further as who has studied the intellectual history and who teaches the intellectual history of race and has taught it before. It is central to my pedagogy practice as a teacher to forefront that, to put anti-racism as what I do every single day, and to stress that we all live of racism. We the system that's perpetuated on these ideas, and to dovetail on what Kemi said, specifically a racist society that is in that where white supremacy is ingrained, and we can't separate that from ourselves. And both those who are oppressed and do the oppressing exist inside of that society, and actively have to engage that racism, whether it is internalized, whether it is self oppression, whether it is oppression from the, whether it is simply not having to deal with it, right? Being able to ignore. All of these are facets of how racism has come to be perpetuated in the society. We don't escape it. We don't get to live outside. And the only way to really challenge that is not only to simply be intentional and attacking anti-racism or racism outside of ourselves, but really looking internally at what we have internalized as people. And I'm stressing internally and repeating that idea just kind of to stress it, that it begins by examining yourself and looking at the ways in which you perpetuate racism, even if you belong to a quote unquote oppressed minority.
Thank you, Dr. Hernandez. Mr. Larson had to leave. He has family coming over, so he had to go. And Ms. Noss, would you like to give a closing word before you have to leave too?
Yeah, so I apologize for having to leave early as well, but I have another commitment. I think the conversations we've all had here today are incredibly positive, and they're moving in the right direction. But I think it's still true that because history is so Eurocentric, because systemic racism isn't acknowledged throughout the entire United States, that we still have a long way to go. Like I said earlier, that we like to think we're a lot more progressive than we actually are. And I make it a point, at least in my class, to really acknowledge the fact that we haven't come as far as we really think we have. But I am incredibly heartened by US students organizing this panel and seeing where we can take the information moving forward. And thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Noss. And Dr. Hernandez has to leave as well if he wants to give anything else that he wants to say. Okay, thank you both for attending. Moving back to the guiding question, Mr. Krieger and then Ms. Howell.
Yeah, what I'm saying, I think hitchhikes back to what Dr. Hernandez is saying, what Kemi was saying about anti-racism becoming kind of a buzzword. And I wanted to bring up something a remarkable thing that happened in our staff development back in August here at American. We had a conversation that went on into lunch in which staff members, particularly staff members of color, shared with the rest of us, shared with all of us, their experience of working at American. And there were not a few tears as colleagues of color talked about the kinds of, well, thoughtless treatment in some cases actively hostile treatment they experience on a regular basis, sometimes from other staff members. So this really hurt me, that because I don't experience these things. But when my colleagues do, then it becomes something I can't just live with and go on not trying to address. So that conversation, several in the conversation said it was the most meaningful conversation they've had in their professional careers because it was real. And so this isn't just my thought. I'm just feeling like it's time to speak about this and bring it up and we did talk about this on that day, maybe in the spirit of Ms. Sangam's comments about staff members needing to take care of ourselves, maybe our staff needs to take care of ourselves as a whole. And I think Mr. Rodriguez was speaking to this too earlier. Maybe we have work to do as a staff, and I think we've acknowledged this as a staff. We have work to do if we are going to try to get beyond our white supremacist thinking, consciously and unconsciously, internalized, externalized. We have to address it. And maybe some of the money the district is saving on paper this year can go to some kind of targeted professional development, whether in-house, Dr. Hernandez has some ideas and resources I know, or bringing in other expertise to help us make our conversation more real. It has to be uncomfortable, yes, but when we get on the other side of it, I think we're going to be better off in our classrooms. I think our students are going to be better in the hands of teachers who have actually kind of are learning, all of us need to continuously do to walk the talk. And I think we'll be better teachers and staff members if we can address some of the problems that are going on among us.
Thank you, Mr. Krieger. And finally, Ms. Howell, before I let Ben take over for the next topic.
Right, my dog is barking right now. I hope they quiet down. Okay, I really appreciate the word. Ms. Kadali mentions when students act totally different in one class, sitting in the front, being active, and then go to the next classroom, sitting in the back, become invisible. Because when I first came to the United States, all my classmates were different color than me. And all I wished is I am invisible. And so I developed the ideas I am not important in that group. But when I came to the California, it's a lot more colorful. So I become a little bit more not invisible. So I really want to say a word about the conversation we have today. I appreciate this platform talking about it so that we have a room to talk about different color, different race, because it is real and it is very personal. So I'll bring it back to the second part of the guiding questions here. What do I do as a classroom teacher? Okay, the color can be the other way around. In my AP classes, it's dominantly Asian students. So at first I treat them all my students same. But one time I have a parent said, "Do you know I'm the only white in the room?" It shocked me. I was like, how is that to do with what I am talking to you about? Then I look at it. My first is defensive response. I don't see any difference between this student just because he is different color. So I was defensive at first. It took me years to think about that question, even though it didn't go anywhere. But I keep on thinking, why is that parents asking me that question? So over time, I developed a very super sensitive. If I have a student coming in that is not nation in a heavy AP class, heavy Asian population AP class, I pay extra attention to who are not Asian now. Because in the past, I just look at them as my students. I love them all dearly. But now that parents reminds me, please look at their color. Then I started to go, oh yeah, I grew up in Asian culture. This is the way I learned, so I click with them. But it does not mean my styles fits their culture. So back to your second questions here, what are some steps that teachers specifically can take to make the classroom environment more inclusive and ensuring that they are teaching racially aware lesson? I don't know, I know how to teach race directly. I need to be taught to teach that. But I do know when I deliver the math and science, I make a conscious effort, deliberate effort to look at now each kid, they come with different colors. And so I have to learn how they learn because they are different. And that's my comments about this. So it's kind of personal, so I raised my voice.
Thank you, Ms. Howell. Ben, would you like to take it away?
Yes, thank you, Bella. We'll be moving on to our last topic now with sexual harassment/assault. Guiding questions for this one are, how can we ensure all genders are educated about other genders' needs and that members of all genders and their needs are respected? And in what ways can we increase accountability for perpetrators of sexual harassment, whether it be staff holding students accountable or staff holding themselves accountable? Ms. Rahman, would you like to comment on this one?
Yeah, I just want to understand first before I ask my question. Is there a process that students can use to bring these sexual harassment incidents to light? And the second part is, if there is one already in place, do students know the process? It's not as simple as saying, it's in the handbook, go read the handbook. We know all high schoolers won't do that. Is there a way that it can be communicated to these students that, hey, if you face harassment, this is where you go. You can go to counselor, you can go to the assistant principal. Is there a process that is clear to them that they know how to handle that? And if there isn't one, I think it's high time we do that, because in the corporate world, there is a process and all employees are clearly taught and explained, and we go through training. Actually, we go through training every 6 months in my company so that we know what's the process, what's acceptable, and how do you bring these to light. And now that we're talking about it, we know that it was very concerning to me when I read some of those testimonials that these girls feel that they cannot bring these incidents to anybody. They feel that they won't be listened to, that they will be dismissed. I wouldn't want my daughter to face that. That is not appropriate, not in 2020. I'm sorry, when I was growing up, yes, we faced a lot of these harassment. Walking on the streets after dark was not something which was safe. You would get pawed upon by people on the roads. I come from that, and I thought it is very safe here, and you don't face that. And it's very concerning to hear that it still goes on in the school, and there are kids who feel that they cannot bring these incidents to somebody in an authoritative position who can take actionable action on that. It's just, I think we need to do something about that. It's just not right.
Thank you, Ms. Roman. Before we get to Ms. Barrington, Kemi has to leave within the next few minutes to finish up some work. So if you'd like to give any closing thoughts.
Yeah, no, thank you. This is great. It's in the 8 p.m. hour over here, and I need to finish before it gets too late. But thank you. This was amazing, and I hope everyone has a great and relaxing weekend.
Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
All right, Ms. Barrington.
Thank you. I wanted to address some of the questions that Ms. Rahman raised regarding, our reporting procedures, because we do have a system in which any student can report a concern of this nature to a staff member, and that it will be fully investigated. And we're in the middle of talking to students about this. We do this at the start of every year through English classes, but we take a lot of time and we talk about how students report and why it's important they report, and the consequences of what happens to students who experience harassment in school and then don't report it. What are the physical, the mental consequences? What are the academic consequences of students not wanting to go to class, of students not being able to focus during class because they're thinking about an incident. What happens when they have to take a different route to school because it's not safe when they want to walk a particular way because they don't want to run into an aggressor or a violator. You know, we do this at the start of every year, but in hearing all these testimonials, it impresses upon me how much what we're doing is not enough, and how we need to provide other avenues for students to report their stories. And if Mr. Larson, you needed to step away, when we do get an opportunity to look at data, I imagine that Americans' data will not be that different than the other high schools in Fremont, in that there are many students who feel that they couldn't directly talk to a student on campus in a crisis situation. So how do we create another avenue where students feel safer being able to report? And if that's a digital method, because I know that you know, a method that I would have used in high school isn't the same that the students would use now. You know, what can we create? And we will work on that, and we need to figure out that system so that we are emphasizing to all students here. And I don't want to specifically say female students, although I know that that is a tendency that we gravitate towards, that this type of harassment happens to those who identify as female, but that it happens to all students, and we really want to make sure they feel empowered. And I have, you know, I have loved learning and hearing about the Me Too movement and how much people are feeling empowered to share their stories. And I just hope that we can create a mechanism so that students feel like they're able to share the stories of what's happening to them at American.
Thank you. Ria?
Yeah, I can just kind of speak from like a student's perspective on it. I personally haven't experienced sexual harassment, so I think my perspective isn't like fully, like, may not be fully accurate, but I can just talk about like how I view the system. I think like it's not as accessible as it should be, and I understand that it was probably brought up towards the start of the school year, but I think like making it more available and like clearly outlining what steps would be taken if that we were to report it would make students feel a bit more comfortable reporting it, because they know how exactly admin is going to proceed with those comments. And also, I think the mention of a digital platform would also be a lot more effective.
Thank you, Ria. Did anyone else want to comment? Oh, okay. Isaiah?
Just going off of what Ria said, I think this ties also to mental health, but also to sexual assault. And I appreciate Ms. Barrington bringing up that even though there are tendencies towards like male on female sexual harassment and assault, it can also go the other way, and it can manifest in different ways with the LGBT community. And as we move forward with distance learning, I just want to bring up my concern over as you're developing these counseling solutions and these one-on-one solutions, I want FUSD to take seriously that Zoom is a compromised service. Zoom is not private in any way. And Zoom has on multiple occasions worked with the anti-democratic Chinese Communist Party. So as you're developing solutions, I know Zoom is a very common platform, but it's important to think and do critical research, not only about the people involved in these programs, but also about the technologies we used and the security issues with these technologies. And since I have a voice now, I'll use it because I know a lot of people dismiss it or don't bring it up, but I think it's important.
Thank you. I think Bella wanted to say something, and then Mr. Fulton wanted to ask a question. So Bella, then Mr. Fulton.
Yeah, I definitely second what both Isaiah and Ria said, especially with Ria talking about how the reporting system is not very accessible. I think, well, like, I guess having more time to reflect on how school operates normally since we're in distance now, like thinking about what goes on in regular school and the conversations that I have with my peers, it's like a disgustingly high amount of comments that I hear from like fellow students talking about like casually talking about like pedophilic teachers, or like, oh, like this student touched me inappropriately the other day. There's never any mention of reporting, like that's not even a thought, because it's just so far removed from what we know. It's like, I've never heard of one student report sexual harassment. It's always talking about it like like over like lunch or something. It's like almost casual, and it shouldn't be casual. It shouldn't be normalized. And I think that goes back a lot to what teachers prioritize, I guess, or it's not entirely teachers, it's a lot of just society in general and student culture, but also like staff and administration and teachers. I don't think there's enough emphasis on it nearly enough. Like I see these like female students, and then they're stuck with these male teachers who many students like we know them as like pedophilic. It's like, oh, you have blank this year, oh, I heard that he's like a pedo, and it's like there's nothing said after that. We're just like, oh, like good luck, don't let him like touch you or anything. It's like never talking about we should bring this to admin, because we know thus far like nothing's happened to remove these people. So I think it's just really frustrating on students' parts, especially female students, when we're brought up in like a society and like at a school environment where it's just we can't even speak about it because we know nothing's going to happen. So we just suppress it, we normalize it, we just make it like a regular talking point where we're like, oh, it's bad that you have to go through this, but it's what so many other people went through. So I'm sure you'll be fine when it's not fine at all.
Thank you, Paula. Mr. Fulton?
I guess I just had a point of clarification because I've seen it come up in our YouTube chat a couple of times, and it rang true with some of the stories. I was wondering if Ms. Barrington, if you could talk to a little bit the difference when issues are reported, especially student to student ones. Can you explain the balance between students feeling like it's being followed up and also respecting students' privacy? Because I think that was one of the big conflicts I've seen in some of the discussion.
Okay. So when an incident of harassment is reported, we have to investigate the situation. So we're going to talk to whomever reported the incident. Sometimes the person reporting the incident isn't the person who is the victim. So we're going to try and gather as much information as we can from who reported, from the victim, from the accused, from any witnesses that are involved. But as we're dealing with an incident, the victim or the reporter aren't always going to learn what the consequences are for the individual who was accused or was found to be a perpetrator of a crime. So there is a level of confidentiality for everyone that's involved in terms of an investigation of any kind of incident. And that can sometimes be perceived as there were no consequences issued to someone who was guilty of an incident because we don't share what those consequences are. There are rules of privacy for any student about pretty much everything that happens within a school environment. So while we can sometimes tell the victim that consequences are issued, it might be perceived as nothing is happening. What I want to make sure that we're really clear about is that if someone is found to have been a perpetrator of an incident, that consequences are issued and there is follow-up. And we do want to make sure we're supporting the victim, both in ensuring that that incident doesn't happen again and making sure we're providing support for that individual, either through a counselor or a school psychologist, to make sure that we're connecting resources to that individual so that they can deal with the trauma that they experienced.
Thank you for that point of clarification, Ms. Barrington. Ms. Sangam?
Sorry, I think yeah, I'm going to lower my hand. I don't really have a comment right now.
Okay, that's fine. Ms. Howell?
Yes, I want to tap into what Ms. Barrington is talking about. And as a result, students perceive it as nothing being done. So what do we do for the healing process? Because when a person reports something, and if they continue to experience repeated incidents, follow up, even though the other students have received the consequence, but the victim continue to still have to put up and undergo all the bully or attacks. Because I heard those kind of things too. And to be honest, it's like we help what we can, we help with what we can, but I really empathize with those students because it becomes a moot point at that moment. It's like, okay, then the worst scenario is even written in the comments that we heard today. The police knock on the door and say, now you have another one that's really you're really in danger because someone is really going after you. So in a way, kids' perception is, if I report it, it only makes it worse. Why would I report it? So number one, yes, we do need to have a system. And once we have a system, we have the protocol, what we do to deal with the incidents. But after that, there are a lot more work to do yet, because if the behavior is not stopping, then that means whatever we do, including reporting consequence, it's all for nothing, because the goal is the behavior has to be stopped and the child has to be protected. So I only have questions, I don't have answers, but I really just want to speak from a community parent's view, because I raised a child in the community too. And the child would just say, don't say anything because it only makes it worse. Please, mom, don't say anything. That's my comment.
Thank you, Ms. Howell. As it is now approaching 5:30 p.m., we will be concluding our Student Support Circle panel discussion for today. For everyone watching on the YouTube live stream, thank you for taking the time. And for our panelists, thank you for taking the time this Friday afternoon to listen to student stories and for discussing the problems our school community faces in an effort to both bridge understandings between us all and find possible solutions. This has been really an amazing conversation to listen to, and only one of the many that we hope to continue to have in the future. And more than conversations, we hope that from this we can take action from the content discussed today. If anyone is still watching on the YouTube live stream, if you have a story you would like to share with us, this is a reiteration, please go to tinyurl.com/AHS testimonies and submit our form to let us know. And for any of the viewers out there who did not submit their stories to be featured in our public comments, thank you for contributing so meaningfully to our forum today. We could not have held it without you. The bravery to share these stories is a major component in having these types of discussions. And yeah, thank you all once again, and hope you all have a good weekend.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
To everyone.
Thank you.